Hi guys. So today the topic is about the protectionism, non-tariff barriers and the organizations in international trade. Uh, but here in this lesson, I'm not going to explain the organizations in the international trade today, but of course I'll be naming them, I'll be introducing them uh, in a very short way. But of course, we are going to take the discussions about the protectionism, the trade protectionism, and what are the influences and what are the advantages on them, as well as the non-tariff barriers which are imposed over the international trade. Okay, so we'll move. So in this lesson outcomes, I should, say this, the areas that I'm going to discuss, right? So in this lesson, we are going to define the trade protectionism in international trade, as well as to understand the importance of protectionism. Why is that so important for the home country or the domestic countries, and explain the nature of non-tariff barriers. And we are going to discuss it in a very descriptive way and make the awareness on the international organizations which are involved in the international businesses. Right. So we'll move to the first slide. I'm sure that you all can see the slides in my next corner, as well as if you do have any concerns, you are feel free to you can feel free to text or even comment on this live discussion forum. And if you have further clarifications, you can of course send me a mail and clarify them as well. Okay. So what you all know as the protectionism, by the word of protecting, in the sense it says that you're going to protect your let's say your country from another force or another country. So in international trade, it's pretty clear that two countries or so many countries are involved in international trade, and one country, while the one country is exporting some of the products, the other country is receiving, in the sense that is importing, right? So in the imports, we have experienced, or we have seen, most of the countries and the most of the economies are encountering so much of problems in importing, because like in a country like Sri Lanka, we have so much of imports than the exports. The final or the ultimate outcome is we will be having an unfavorable trade balance, or let's say balance of trade. Finally, our import expenses are greater than the export income. So which means the net export income will be a minus figure. So because of that, these types of unfavorable circumstances, the occurrences, the government of Sri Lanka or governments of the countries are getting some of the, or imposing some of the strategies, imposing some of the barriers to international trade. So in our previous lesson, we discussed about the tariff types of, or the tariff barriers which are imposed over the government imports. But when it comes to today's lesson, we are going to discuss about the non-tariff barriers as well. Fine. Before that, we have to discuss about this protectionism. So protectionism is basically an economical policy of a country which is governed by the government of that particular economy to restrain or to restrict some of the imports to that particular economy and protect the home country, or let's say the domestic country markets. So easily that can be defined as in the slide. It can be defined as a protectionism is a economic policy of restricting imports of goods and services from other countries to the domestic economy. And through the methods of, as I told you earlier, tariff and non-tariff barriers, they are going to impose some of the restrictions, and they are going to to restrict some of the unwanted imports, right? So we'll see what are they. Now, the importance, when it comes to the importance and the expectation of this protectionism over the countries, there are so much of things, whatever expected by the government of a particular economy. So basically, to improve the country's balance of trade by reducing the imports. How can you improve the balance of trades? In the sense, the balance of trade defines the net quantity, or let's say the commodity of your exports. In the sense, you are going to, you being a individual economy, So that particular economy is exporting some of the commodities to the other countries, and as well as they are receiving some of the commodities from the other countries as well. So that is called imports. The receiving part is called imports, as well as whatever the things that you are sending to those countries are known as the exports. So to maintain a favorable balance of trade, in the sense, you must encourage your exports than your imports. To restrict the unwanted imports to your country, the government has to make some of the decisions or some of the policies to restrict them in importing. So that is one of the expectation through this imposition of trade barriers or the restrictions. Second one is encourage the increase the exports. Yes, of course, with the number of, restricting the number of imports, as well as you can encourage your domestic trades to produce more. So if you have an excess, or if you have some of the commodities to be sent to the foreign countries, of course, you are at the simultaneously, you can at the same time you can export those commodities to the other countries as well, right? The third one is to protect the home country trades. Of course, whenever you are receiving some of the other commodities from different markets, or let's say from the different countries, what you will experience is your home country trade, your home country or the domestic producers won't encourage their production, in the sense, since there are so many of goods available in the market which can be substitute for whatever you are producing in your home economy, so they won't produce them, and ultimately the marketers, or let's say the domestic producers, will discourage to produce their production, right? You can omit that through imposing all these market, or let's say the import restrictions. Fourth, restrain category killers, those who are releasing the counterfeit, low cost inferior productions. Now, as an example, let's say I can't mention some of the names of the countries, but of course you can see some of the cheapest products, some of the inferior quality products are available in the market. We call them as the second quality products in Sri Lanka. Now, being an economy which has so many types of industries engaged in producing all these technical equipments, can be the apparel manufacturers, and there are so many types of different types of products available and producers available in the market. But of course, in the sense that you are engaging in importing the excess commodity or the dumping commodities of the other countries, as well as the commodities which are not quality enough to use by the consumers. So I think in my case it's unfavorable to the market producers or domestic producers, because domestic producers are always trying to release their productions with a high quality, and also having some of the products with a very good quality but still at a cheap price will reduce the number of production of the domestic producer. To refrain or to restrict it, of course, that is basically we call them as the category killers in marketing. Category killers in the sense, now in your category there are there's a specific sort of a price range, but other than despite of the price range, if there's anybody who produces, or let's say making the market available, let's say making them available in the market at a cheapest price, at a lower price, we call them as a category killers, because they are going to dig that particular market and they are going to rob that particular market, right? So by allowing to the import markets to come into the country and make their products available in the country at a cheaper price, so the consumers will definitely move to those products as well. So end of the day, you as economy, your domestic products will not be sold to the consumers, so ultimately they will be discouraged with the production. So to omit it, you can use this trade protectionism policies, right? So there are now we've discussed about the tariff barriers in our the last session, but in this session we are going to consider about the non-tariff barriers. Tariff in the sense, it's a sum, which means it's a sort of a currency value. But here we are not going to involve all these currencies, and we are going to you know charge some of the amounts from the importers, but of course we are going to make some of the other ways to to restrict some of the imports. Those are called as non-tariff barriers, right? The first one is the quota system. The system called quota system: import licensing, consular formalities, trading blocks you may have heard of, and the customs regulations, as well as the state trading, foreign exchange regulations, and health and safety measures. These are the things, or these are the non-tariff barriers which we are going to use in today's environment to restrict some of the unwanted imports. Okay, to limit the imports as well, right? So we'll have a discuss on each of these, right? So quota. What do you mean by a quota? Now, normally, okay, coming to your general life, you may have heard of data quotas, right? Because you being the people, those who are referring to the internet as, you know, in your day-to-day life, you may have heard of data quotas. Your daily data quota, your nighttime data quota, your anytime data quota. These are very, common. What do you mean by a quota? It's a sort of a specific commodity or a limit of, it's a quantity which is given for a specific time. That is what you call as quota. Now, when it comes to the quota, it can be defined as in a specific time, a commodity for a particular good is set to import. It can be from various countries, of course, but of course, let's say, if you are importing some of the, simply let's say, a good like computer equipment, let's say mouses, laser mouses. So there can be a commodity which is set for a specific period. Let's say for this year, there's a quota to import 39 million of laser mouse to Sri Lankan economy. It can be from USA, it can be from UK, it can be from Australia, it can be from New Zealand, Netherlands, whatever it is, China or else. You can bring them. 39 million is allowed to bring down within a specific period, that is until the end of this year. But after this year, you can also consider for some quantity which is again governed by the policymakers, or let's say by the quota. So in this case, the traders cannot import the commodities as they want because there's a restriction. 39 million in the sense that is 39, not 40 million, not 39.1. So there's a restriction for that particular time period. Of course, after the time bound, they can consider about importing all these commodities again according to the policy made by the governors. Right. So there are various types of quotas available in the market, in the sense in international trade. First one is tariff quota. Tariff quota in the sense that will set to a limit, as I told you earlier, the quota is set for a limit. But of course, if you are going to exceed, some of the medicines are there. No? As an example, let's say in an example of medicines, though there's a quota, if the urgency is high, so because of that, the producers, or let's say the importers, must have to bring them down into the country. So because of that, in that particular sense, the importers may have to make another sort of let's say a tariff. It's like some equivalent for a sort of a tax, right? For that particular, the numbers exceeding the particular quota, right? Then the second one is the unilateral quota. Unilateral is the nature of there's a extreme ceiling of importing items. Now let's say, even though you want to bring some of the commodities down, but with these unilateral quotas, you cannot bring them because there's a high ceiling limit. If you reach to the ceiling limit, you cannot. It's like if you reach to that ceiling limit, there's no option of top up your data plans. It's like that. You don't have any choice, right? You have to wait until the next year or next period. and bilateral quotas. Bilateral in the sense the quantity is almost fixed between the countries as per the negotiation terms between the two economies. Now, when you are coming to the bilateral quotas, bilateral in the sense there are two parties, bilaterally agreed. So your two countries are having agreed to import this much of commodity to the country in a particular period, right? So those are called as the negotiation terms. Under the negotiation terms, they may have discussed within your governments, within your economies, they have discussed. So at that case, the quantity is almost been fixed between the two territories, and as per the negotiation terms, they are doing their trade, right? Where anyone cannot breach their terms or conditions in their trade, right? And mixing quota. Mixing quota is the last type of a quota that we have. It's like almost, it's charging a percentile something. Let's say if the import is for a production process, if the material is available from your domestic country, let's say, as an example, we being Sri Lanka is a manufacturer for the apparels at large. So let's say we have enough material, let's say cotton. But of course, somebody can have a contract, import contract, in importing some of the cotton from another country, right? That can be because of the commissions, that can be because of the quality of the cotton or whatever. But of course, if somebody is importing them, there's a mixing quota imposed by the government saying that you must use your own country materials for a percentile rate, let's say for 40%, even if you are importing rest of the 60% from the other country. That is the idea of mixing quota. So as an example, if the import is for the production process, if the material is available from the home country, the producer must have to utilize percentile proportion from the resources of the home country as well. So which will omit 100% imports from the other countries, where you will use your 40% from your country's resources. Okay, so we'll move to the next strategy. That is called import licensing. What do you mean by import licensing? There should be a license to import. Yes, that is correct. So the importers must have in the license to import a particular defined product to that particular economy. Without having a license, you cannot import commodities to that particular economy, right? That is called import licensing. Then the second one is the consular formalities. Consular formalities in the sense they will restrict some unwanted imports, and if the importer doesn't comply the requirements, the authorities will make the necessary actions. As well as, when it comes to consular formalities, there are some of the regulations imposed by the government, or let's say the authorities, or can be the customs, to the particular importer. Now, in the case of, let's say, the importer is trying to import some of the commodities without the trade license, without import license. So all these, the requirements of the documents, or let's say the requirements of some of the necessities are mentioned in the let's say the quota condition sheet. So that sort of, if the importer is not in a position to comply all this material, so then the government will take the necessary actions against him, right? So that is called the consular formalities, right? And the trading blocks. What are the trading blocks? This is basically intergovernmental arrangement about the international trade. Now, as an example, when it comes to Sri Lanka, have you heard of SAARC countries? Yes. In SAARC countries, we have intergovernment trade agreements. Intergovernment. We and India has a one, and India and Pakistan is having a one, right? So this much of, there can be more or two governments agreed for the type of international trade together. So those are the trading blocks. So we can easily say a trade bloc is a type of intergovernmental agreement, often the part of the regional intergovernmental organization where the barriers to the trade are reduced or eliminated among the participating states. Now there's a speciality, because why? Now once you have agreed with another party, with another government, or with another economy, you must be uh, you know if you have pre-agreed quotas, pre-agreed conditions and terms, you must you have already regionally legally bounded. So because of that, in some cases, some of the elements will be tax exempted or tariff exempted, but some of the things will be restricted, right? So that is the nature of intergovernmental legal arrangements, or let's say the agreements in international trade, where those are called as trading blocks. So the importance of these things, in the sense, you won't get export tariffs over these agreements. Let's say if India wants to send us some of the commodities like bicycles to the investment projects which are governed and monitored by the Board of Investments of Sri Lanka. So they will be make an agreement over those commodities which are tax exempted. So because of that, because of the tax exemption, Sri Lankan government or the Board of Investment of Sri Lanka doesn't want to pay tax to them, tax to the Indian government, because those are tax exempted in the intergovernment arrangements of the agreements. So that is the way of trading blocks. Okay. Then the next one is customs regulations. If an importer doesn't make the sense of allowing, or let's say doesn't comply the requirements governed by the customs of that particular economy, the customs have the sole right to restrict that sort of import to the particular country. Then home country or the domestic country government, the customs can refrain from accepting those types of imports to the economy. Right. Then state trading. You may have seen there's an institution called STC, State Trading Corporation, right? The reason is that no one is going to now. In some instances, the state, even though the state trading corporation is located or let's say established, but the others are also involved in importing. But when it comes to mostly the countries like the government is ruling the imports, they have this type of institution established like state trading corporations. Why? What is the reason? That is to directly all the imports which are happening to the country or the economy will be monitored and governed by this STC, let's say the state trading entity. So they are having the powers to govern and to execute imports and export of a particular economy, right? So these are the ways of restricting the economy's imports other than the tariff plans of the economies. The next one is foreign exchange regulation, right? In some countries, there are some of the let's say some of the restrictions imposed by the governments over the foreign countries, or the foreign exchange, that is to minimize the demand for the foreign exchange. Now, as an example, whenever you are exporting some of commodities, there's no hassle. But if you are importing some of the commodities, you may have to pay for that. Now, governments like Sri Lanka, let's say you are importing some of the commodities from USA to the Sri Lankan economy. So because of that, you may have to pay a sum. Now the Sri Lankan rupee is almost like the US dollar is almost 186 rupees. That is the exchange rate, right? So to buy a $1 worth product to Sri Lanka, you will have to pay 186 rupees in return to the USA. So to omit that sort of a higher payments And to make the the foreign exchange stability, the governments are imposing some of the strategies called foreign exchange regulations. You cannot, in the case of imports, you are restricted to use the foreign exchange you earned through the imports to the economy. There are so many, so much of ways that you can, the reasons to omit this thing, because um, that is what we call as economical injections as well, right? You inject some of the artificial money to the country as well, the economy as well, right? There are so many things. We'll discuss about them later in this chapter. But when it comes to the foreign exchange, there are some ways like you can restrict. The expectation of all these foreign exchange regulations are to restrict the demand for foreign exchange, to refrain the national currency devaluation. That is called, like, whenever you are purchasing more and more from the foreign countries, your national currency value getting devaluated, and also to maintain the value of exchange rate as well, right? And to check the flow of capital as well, they will impose some of the foreign exchange regulations, right? I'm sure that you are not having that sort of a clear picture about these things, but of course, those are sufficient to know. That is sufficient to know about some of the matters, like the foreign exchange regulations are doing for the, as it is used as a non-tariff strategy to restrict some of the unwanted imports, right? Then health and safety measures, especially when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, especially when it comes to the some of the products, like, which concerns, which are used to facilitating health and safety of a country's population. So there are some prescribed health and safety rules by that particular country. Now, as an example, when it comes to the motorcycle helmets in Sri Lanka, there's a safety standard, there's a rule and rules and regulations to met with. And also some of the pharmaceutical items, like especially the surgery equipments and the medicines and everything, you must have to comply some of the regulations imposed by the national government. Without them, you cannot import some of the drugs. It can be medicines, it can be some of surgical items, it can be some of safety items. You cannot get them without complying all these safety instructions of a particular country, right? So with that, you will limit some of the unnecessary imports which can be happening to the governments. But of course, at the same time, this is not a political campaign, I should say. Having an open economy policy is not a harmful, it's not a disaster for an economy, right? Most of the people are telling, after the open economic policy, the country has, ended with whatever the debts and things. Yes, but of course, why? There should be a good governance to control all these unwanted imports. That is the case. Having open economic policy, in the sense, you will receive so much of goods and commodities, but it's up to the government to control it. It's not the fault of open economic policy, because without open economic policy, we cannot synchronize with the globalization as well. So giving that as a message to you all, I would like to move to the other part of the lesson today, that is to introduce the international organizations which are involving in international trade. So we will be going to discuss this later in our next session. So coming to the international organizations, the first one is the World Trade Organization. We will be discussing this later. And the next one is the World Bank. Under the World Bank, there are three types of the sub-organizations as well. International Financial Corporation, known as the IFC, International Development Association, known as IDA, and International Center for Settlement of Investment Dispute, that is called ICSID, as well as International Monetary Fund, known as IMF. So we will be discussing all these things in our new and the next online session. So if you do have any concerns, if you need further clarifications, you can of course comment, or even if you can chat, and even if you can send an email so I can clarify the matters and get back to you. Thank you very much for being on time with my session. Thank you.